It was an unusually quiet afternoon when a little girl, no older than 9, walked into the local police station. Her eyes, big and wide with a mix of fear and determination, scanned the room as she nervously approached the front desk. The officer sitting behind the counter looked up, startled by her presence. She wasn't there with an adult, and she definitely wasn't there for anything ordinary. The officer, still unsure of what was going on, leaned forward and asked, "Can I help you, little one?" The girl swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper, but her words carried the weight of something far more serious than her small frame suggested. "My stepmother makes me work a lot," she said, her voice trembling but filled with a quiet strength. "I need help. I can't take it anymore." The officer blinked, unsure of how to respond. At first glance, the girl seemed like any other child, innocent, quiet, maybe even a little shy. But there was something in her eyes that told a different story. Behind the sweetness and the innocence, there was a deep sadness, a desperation that couldn't be ignored. Her clothes were simple, maybe a bit too worn out, and there was an exhaustion in her posture that no child should ever have to carry. The officer, sensing the seriousness of the situation, leaned forward, gently guiding the girl to sit down. She seemed to hesitate, but after a moment, she took a seat. "Tell me everything," the officer said softly, trying to comfort the girl, even though she knew this was no ordinary case. And so the little girl began her story. It wasn't always like this, at least not at first. When her father married her stepmother, the little girl had been hopeful. She had imagined that things might change, that her new family would be full of love, laughter, and maybe even the joy of having someone who cared for her. But reality, as it often does, was much harsher. It didn't take long before she noticed how different her life had become. Her stepmother, whom she had tried to call Mom at first, quickly showed her true colors. The little girl would spend hours each day doing chores, more than any child should ever have to do. At first, it was small things, sweeping the floors, washing dishes, tidying up after the stepmother's various projects. But it soon escalated. She was made to clean the entire house by herself, scrubbing floors, washing windows, and even cooking meals, all while her stepmother sat back, offering no help, no encouragement, just a cold, distant gaze. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the little girl became tired. So tired. Her shoulders ached, her hands were often raw from scrubbing, and her head would throb by the end of each day. She tried to talk to her father, to explain that something wasn't right, but he just brushed it off. "Your stepmother is just trying to teach you responsibility," he would say, smiling in that way that made her feel like her concerns didn't matter. But it wasn't just about the work. The stepmother's cruelty went beyond that. There were moments when the girl would try to sneak a few minutes of playtime or rest, only to be scolded, told she was lazy or ungrateful. She was never allowed to have fun, never allowed to just be a kid. It wasn't about her being helpful, it was about control. Her stepmother didn't care about her happiness or well-being. She only cared about having someone to do her bidding. The girl tried to be patient. She tried to follow the rules, tried to do what she was told. But with each passing day, the weight of her stepmother's demands grew heavier. She began to feel small, invisible, like she was just a servant in her own home. And no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. There was always more to do, always something else that needed fixing. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, the little girl sat on the stairs in the quiet of her home, tears rolling down her cheeks. She couldn't take it anymore. She didn't know where to turn or who to trust. Her father didn't seem to see the problem, and her stepmother was a constant force that she couldn't escape. That's when she decided. She had to do something. It was scary, more terrifying than she had ever felt in her short life. But she couldn't just sit back and let her stepmother's cruelty continue. And so she did what many would never expect a little girl to do. She made her way to the police station, walking on her own, trying to muster every ounce of courage she had left. She knew she wasn't just going there for herself. She was going there to ask for help, to speak out, to tell someone the truth of what she had been going through. But what happened next was even more surprising than anyone could have imagined. As the officer listened, the little girl's story continued to unfold, revealing secrets about her stepmother that no one could have guessed. There were rumors of past actions, whispers of things that had happened to other children before her, things that had been hidden from the outside world. The officer leaned back, taking in everything the little girl had said. There was no doubt in her mind that something had to be done, but what? How could they help this child when everything seemed so tangled? What would her father say when he found out that his daughter had gone to the police? And more importantly, would the little girl be safe in her own home after all of this? The tension in the room grew thick as the officer prepared to make a decision. Would she call the authorities? Should she get the child to safety? And what about the girl's father? Could he be trusted? For now, all the officer could do was listen, trying to understand the gravity of the situation. But one thing was clear. The little girl's courage had set something in motion. And soon, the truth about what was happening behind closed doors would come to light. What happens next? Stay tuned to find out. The officer sat there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she listened to the little girl's story. She had heard countless cases of troubled children, but something about this one felt different. There was an urgency in the girl's voice, a desperation that made it impossible to ignore. As the girl spoke, her story unfolded in a way that made the officer's heart ache. The little girl, whose name was Emma, was only 9 years old, but the weight of the world seemed to rest on her tiny shoulders. She spoke softly, her words careful, almost as if she were afraid someone might overhear. She told the officer about her life before her father remarried. It was far from perfect, but at least she had felt loved. Her mother had passed away when she was very young, and her father had done his best to raise her on his own. They didn't have much, but they had each other. That was enough for Emma. But when her father met Susan, everything changed. At first, Emma had been hopeful. She had always wanted a mother figure in her life, someone who could take care of her, someone who could fill the void her mother had left behind. But Susan wasn't the person Emma had imagined. She was nice at first, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. But after they got married, she started asking me to do things. At first, it was just little things like folding laundry or helping with the dishes. But then it got worse. She would make me clean the entire house, sweep, mop, scrub. Sometimes I would be up until midnight, and she'd still find something to complain about. Emma paused for a moment, her eyes downcast. The officer could tell this wasn't easy for her. I tried to tell my dad. Emma continued, but he would always say I was being dramatic. He said I had to learn responsibility, but it wasn't about learning anything. She just wanted me to do everything for her. I don't think he sees it. He just doesn't know. The officer nodded, understanding now why Emma had come to the station. She didn't feel safe at home. She didn't feel loved. And the worst part was, she felt invisible to the one person who should have protected her, the man she called her father. As Emma spoke, the officer couldn't help but wonder if Susan's cruelty went deeper than just excessive demands for chores. The way Emma's voice trembled when she talked about her stepmother suggested that there was more to the story. Something darker, something hidden behind the seemingly perfect facade that Susan put on for everyone else. The officer leaned in, her voice gentle but firm. Is there anything else you need to tell me, Emma? Something that might help us understand what's going on. Emma's eyes darted around the room, as though she were afraid someone might be watching. Then, with a deep breath, she whispered, "Sometimes, when I don't do things perfectly, she gets really mad. She'll yell at me, tell me I'm worthless. And sometimes she hits me. Not hard, just enough to make me know I've done something wrong. But it's never enough to show on the outside." The officer's stomach twisted in knots as Emma's words sank in. It wasn't just the physical labor, it was the emotional toll that Susan's behavior was taking on her. And the worst part was that Emma was so used to it, now that she didn't even recognize it for what it was: abuse. The officer stood up and walked over to a small file cabinet, pulling out a piece of paper. She scribbled down a few notes, her mind racing. This was more than just a case of an overbearing stepmother. This was something much more serious, something that needed to be addressed immediately. But as the officer prepared to make her next move, a thought stopped her cold. What if Emma's father didn't believe her? What if he sided with Susan, as he always had? Emma would be in even greater danger than she was now, and the officer knew that if things didn't change quickly, there might be no way to undo the damage that had already been done. "Emma," the officer said softly, "I'm going to help you. But we need to take this one step at a time. I need to speak to your father and find out what's going on. We're going to make sure you're safe." But Emma's face paled. "I don't want my dad to know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He won't believe me. He always takes her side. I don't know what to do anymore." The officer paused, thinking. She knew the delicate balance she had to strike. Emma was scared of her father, scared of her stepmother, scared of what might happen next. But she also knew that leaving Emma in that situation was not an option. "Listen, Emma," the officer said gently. "I understand that this is hard, but you need to trust me. I'll make sure that you're safe, no matter what. And we'll make sure your dad knows what's really happening." But even as the officer spoke those reassuring words, she felt a gnawing feeling of uncertainty deep in her chest. What if she was wrong? What if Emma's father truly didn't see what was happening? What if Susan had such control over him that nothing could be done? The tension in the air was thick, and the officer knew that the path ahead would be anything but easy. She had a duty to protect Emma, but that meant confronting a family dynamic that could potentially explode. The last thing she wanted was to make things worse for the little girl. Still, the decision was made. The officer would act immediately. She couldn't let this child suffer any longer. But as she prepared to make the call, she couldn't shake the fear that something even more dangerous was lurking beneath the surface. Was Emma's father truly in the dark, or had he turned a blind eye to the suffering in his own home? The officer sat back, her mind racing as she picked up the phone. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. She had to act fast, but she also had to be careful. Emma was depending on her. Her safety, her future, it all hinged on the next steps. The officer's heart pounded in her ears as she dialed the number for Child Protective Services, knowing that once she made the call, there would be no turning back. As the phone rang, the officer glanced at Emma, who was sitting quietly, her eyes wide with both fear and a flicker of hope. For the first time since they had started talking, the girl looked as though she believed someone was actually going to help her. The officer gave her a small, reassuring smile, though inside she felt anything but calm. But just as the phone began to connect, the door to the office swung open. Emma's father walked in, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. He looked down at Emma, who flinched slightly, then turned to the officer. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The officer's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected him to arrive so soon. And now that he was here, she knew the moment of truth had arrived. The delicate balance she had been holding onto was about to tip. She had to be careful. He was Emma's father, and whatever happened now would shape the rest of the girl's life. "Sir, I think we need to talk," the officer said, trying to keep her voice steady. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Please, sit down." Emma's father hesitated, but eventually complied. His eyes flickered between the officer and his daughter, a silent tension thick in the air. The officer could see his protective instincts kicking in, but there was something else, too, a certain distance, a coldness that suggested there were things he wasn't seeing, things he wasn't willing to acknowledge. "I don't know what this is about," he said, his voice still guarded. "Emma's been acting strange lately, but I thought it was just a phase." The officer took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the moment, the stakes rising with every word. She couldn't afford to be gentle with this now. Emma needed him to understand. "I need to be honest with you, sir," the officer began, her voice firm. "Your daughter came to me today because she's been suffering in silence. She's been working far beyond what's expected of a child her age, and the emotional toll it's taken on her is significant. She feels like she has no one to turn to, and that's why she came here." Emma's father's brow furrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about. Emma's just being lazy. She needs discipline, that's all." The officer's jaw tightened. She had expected this. She had known that a part of Emma's father would resist, would try to justify his wife's actions. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. "No, sir," the officer said, her voice sharp. "This isn't about discipline. This is about a pattern of neglect and emotional abuse. And it's been going on for far too long. Your daughter is in pain, and it's clear that she's been hiding it from you because she's afraid you won't believe her." For a moment, there was silence. The tension in the room grew unbearable. Emma's father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face a mask of disbelief. But then something shifted. His eyes flickered toward Emma, and for the first time, the officer saw a hint of doubt in his gaze. "Is this true?" he asked Emma, his voice barely audible. Emma nodded, her lip trembling. "Yes, Dad, it's true. She makes me work all the time. I'm so tired, and I'm scared." The room seemed to hold its breath as Emma's father sat in stunned silence. It was as though he was hearing her words for the first time. The officer could see the wheels turning in his mind, the dawning realization that his daughter had been suffering right under his nose. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice cracking. Emma's father reached out slowly, his hand trembling as he placed it on her shoulder. Emma flinched at first, but then slowly she relaxed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time in what felt like forever, her father was acknowledging her pain. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, the guilt clear in his eyes. "I should have seen this. I should have done something sooner." The officer stood up, feeling a small sense of relief. She had done what she needed to do. Emma was finally being heard, and her father was starting to understand the gravity of the situation. There was a long road ahead, but at least they were at the beginning of it. "I'm going to make sure Emma is safe," the officer said, her voice calm but resolute. "And we'll take the next steps together. We'll figure out what needs to happen for her to heal from all of this." Emma looked up at her father, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. It would take time for everything to be fixed. It would take time for her father to rebuild his trust in her, and for him to confront the truth about Susan. But for the first time, Emma believed that there was a way out. She wasn't alone anymore. As the officer left the room, she couldn't help but reflect on the path Emma had taken to get here. It hadn't been easy. The road to healing was never simple, and there were still many obstacles ahead. But one thing was clear. Emma's courage had made all the difference. She had spoken out when she could have stayed silent. She had taken the first step toward freedom, And with that, the world seemed a little less daunting. For Emma, and for so many children like her, this story wasn't over. But this chapter had ended with hope, and that was enough for now. The only thing the officer knew for sure was that the real challenge had just begun, and nothing was as simple as it seemed.